The whole town gathered below, and Marcus Callahan watched from his window like a man studying a world he could no longer enter. Golden lamplight spilled from the community hall's frosted windows, painting the November evening in shades of honey and amber. Laughter drifted up the hill, faint, warm, belonging to everyone but him. Marcus pressed his palm against the cold glass and felt the distance in his bones. Behind him, Timothy rocked in his chair, humming a melody only he understood. "Supper's ready," Marcus said, though the boy wouldn't answer with words. Timothy never did. He communicated in smiles and sounds, in the way his fingers traced patterns on tabletops, in the sudden brightness of his eyes when something delighted him. Marcus set 2 bowls of cornbread and beans on the rough-hewn table. Simple fare, honest fare. The kind of meal a man made when he'd stopped expecting anything more. 3 years since the invitation stopped coming. 3 years since Cedar Hollow decided that Marcus and his different son were too much trouble. Too uncomfortable. Too strange for polite company. Nobody said it outright. Frontier folk rarely did. They simply stopped knocking, stopped waving, stopped including the Callahans in the rhythm of community life. Marcus had learned to call it peace. Timothy abandoned his rocking and shuffled to the table, his movements uneven but purposeful. At 12 years old, he was tall for his age, with his mother's dark hair and his father's stubborn jaw. His condition, the doctors back east had used words Marcus couldn't pronounce, made his body move differently, made his mind work in patterns others couldn't follow. It scared people. Marcus had grown used to that. He spooned beans into Timothy's bowl and noticed the boy's attention drift toward the wall. There, pinned between a faded calendar and a dried sprig of sage, hung a drawing Timothy had made last spring. 3 stick figures stood beneath a yellow sun, a tall one, a smaller one, and a third with bright yellow hair streaming behind her like a banner. Marcus had never asked who she was. He wasn't sure he wanted to know. "Eat," he said gently, guiding Timothy's hand toward the spoon. The boy complied, but his gaze kept wandering to the window, to that distant golden glow. He hummed louder, a sound Marcus recognized as longing, though he'd never admit it. "We have everything we need right here," Marcus said. The words tasted like rust. He poured himself weak coffee and sat across from his son, watching the steam curl upward in the lamplight. His hands trembled slightly. They did that sometimes, when the loneliness pressed too close. Outside, the celebration continued. Inside, father and son ate in silence. Then Timothy stopped humming. The sudden quiet made Marcus look up. The boy was pointing toward the window, his whole body rigid with attention. Marcus turned. A lantern swung in the darkness. Someone was walking up the hill. The knock came firm and steady, 3 sharp raps that echoed through the cabin like a summons. Marcus rose slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. Nobody came to this door anymore. Nobody had business on this hill after dark. He crossed to the entrance and pulled it open, cold air rushing past him like an uninvited guest. Agnes Whitmore stood on his porch. The school teacher wore a thick wool shawl wrapped tight against the November chill, her breath clouding in the lamplight. She carried a basket covered with checkered cloth, and her expression lured. Her expression held the kind of determination that made mountains move. "Mr. Callahan," she said. Not a question, a statement. "Miss Whitmore." Marcus blocked the doorway with his body. An old habit. Something wrong at the schoolhouse? Nothing's wrong anywhere except right here. She lifted her chin. "You're coming to Thanksgiving dinner, both of you." Marcus blinked. The words didn't make sense. Arranged like that? "I beg your pardon. The community supper? Down the hill. You and Timothy are coming." Agnes spoke as if she were announcing the weather, simple, factual, beyond argument. "We're fine here." Marcus gripped the doorframe. "Timothy can't what?" The question hung between them, sharp as a blade. Marcus fumbled for words. "Can't behave properly. Can't sit still. Can't be normal." Every excuse he'd built over 3 years suddenly felt thin and shameful. "He can," Agnes said, her voice softening just slightly. "I'll help." Before Marcus could respond, she stepped past him into the cabin. The woman moved like she owned the place, like she had every right to cross his threshold and rearrange his careful isolation. He stood frozen, door still open, cold wind at his back. Agnes approached Timothy where he sat at the table. She moved slowly, giving the boy time to notice her, to adjust. Then she knelt beside his chair, bringing herself to his level. "Hello, Timothy," she said. "I brought you something." She lifted the cloth from her basket and produced a biscuit golden brown, still warm from the oven. She held it out like an offering. Timothy studied her face with those searching eyes of his. He reached for the biscuit, took it carefully, and brought it to his nose to smell before taking a small bite. Then he smiled. That smile, rare as spring rain, bright as morning, transformed his whole face. Marcus felt his chest tighten. He'd seen that smile perhaps a dozen times in the past year, each one a gift. Agnes looked up at Marcus, and he saw something in her eyes he couldn't name. Compassion. Perhaps. Her challenge. "When did you decide," she asked quietly, "that your son didn't deserve to sit at the same table as everyone else?" The question struck him like a physical blow. Marcus opened his mouth to protest, to defend, to explain all the reasons why isolation was better, safer. Kinder, but Timothy was already reaching for Agnes's hand, his fingers wrapping around hers with complete trust. His son had chosen. Marcus had no argument left. Marcus buttoned Timothy's coat with trembling fingers, fumbling the worn brass buttons like a man who'd forgotten how hands worked. Behind him, Agnes waited by the door, patient as stone. She hadn't said another word since that question, the one that still rang in his ears like a bell struck 2. Hard. She simply stood there, lantern in hand, as if she had all the time in the world, as if she knew he would come. The coat buttons blurred before Marcus's eyes, and suddenly he wasn't in the cabin anymore. He was standing in the churchyard 3 years ago, Sarah's coffin lowering into frozen ground while Timothy wailed in his arms. The neighbors had come then for the funeral. At least, they'd brought covered dishes and murmured condolences and looked at Timothy with that particular expression. Marcus had come to recognize pity mixed with relief. Thank God it isn't my child. After the funeral, the visits slowed. After the first month, they stopped entirely. Marcus told himself it was because people were busy, because frontier life demanded attention, because winter was hard on everyone. But he knew the truth. Timothy's condition frightened them. His sounds, his movements, his differentness. It reminded people that the world was unpredictable, that children could be born with minds that worked in mysterious ways, that normal was just a word folks used to feel safe. The church social had been the end. Marcus had tried, God knows he'd tried to give Timothy some piece of community life, but the boy had grown overwhelmed by the noise and crowd. He'd flapped his hands and cried out, and Mrs. Patterson had shrieked as if Timothy were some kind of monster. They'd walked home that night in silence. They hadn't gone back. Now Marcus smoothed Timothy's coat and looked into his son's face. The boy was calm, expectant, his gaze fixed on Agnes with something like hope. "We don't have to go," Marcus said softly. "We can stay here. It's warm. It's safe." Timothy didn't answer. He never did, not with words. But he pulled toward the door, toward Agnes, toward the golden light visible through the window. The message was clear enough. Marcus straightened. His bones felt old, older than his 34 years. The weight of 3 years' isolation pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden. Agnes opened the door. Cold air rushed in, carrying the distant sound of laughter. "Ready?" she asked. No, he would never be ready. But his son was already moving, already reaching for Agnes's hand, already stepping across the threshold into the night. Marcus followed. What else could he do? The door closed behind them with a sound like finality. The cabin stood dark and empty now. waiting for their return, or perhaps waiting to see if they would return the same. The three of them walked down the hill together. The community hall grew larger with each step, its windows blazing with warmth and welcome that Marcus had stopped believing in. Timothy hummed as they walked, a happy sound, an anticipating sound. There was no going back now. The community hall doors swung open, and the world stopped. Warmth rushed out to meet them, heat from the great stone fireplace, steam rising from platters of food, the accumulated presence of 60-some bodies pressed close together. And with the warmth came silence. Absolute, pressing silence. Every face turned toward the doorway. Marcus felt their eyes like physical weight. Old Mr. Hendricks paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. Mrs. Patterson's hand flew to her chest as if warding off evil. Children stopped their chasing games to stare. Even the dogs under the tables went still. Timothy noticed the attention. Of course he did. The boy was sensitive to such things, reading atmosphere like others read words. His humming grew louder, a self-soothing sound that seemed to echo in the quiet hall. Agnes didn't hesitate. She walked forward as if nothing unusual had happened, as if 100 eyes weren't watching their every step. Her hand found Timothy's shoulder, steadying him, and she guided them both toward a cluster of empty seats near the hall's center. "Reserved these myself," she announced, her voice carrying across the silence. "Wasn't sure if you'd make it, but I saved 3 places just in case." The seats waited beside Widow Pearson, a gray-haired woman with kind eyes who had been Sarah's friend. Years ago. She looked at Marcus, then at Timothy, then at Agnes. Something complicated passed across her face. Then she lifted the gravy boat and held it toward Marcus. "Welcome," she said. The word came out rough, uncertain, but real. Marcus took the gravy boat. His hands were steady now. Fear had a way of burning off when you were already in the fire. He served Timothy first, then himself, moving through the motions while the hall slowly, gradually, returned to life around them. Conversations resumed in hushed tones. Forks scraped against plates. Children whispered and pointed, earning sharp looks from parents. Timothy touched the tablecloth, fascinated by its texture. It was fine linen brought out only for special occasions, and the boy ran his fingers across the weave with the intensity he brought to everything. He found a loose thread and pulled it gently. Watching the fabric pucker. "That's pretty, isn't it?" Agnes said, leaning close. "Feel how smooth it is." Timothy made a sound, not words, but acknowledgement. He continued exploring the cloth while Agnes arranged food on his plate. Marcus watched her work. She cut the turkey into small pieces without being asked, positioned the mashed potatoes where Timothy could reach them easily, moved the gravy boat to a safe distance from his exploring hands. She did it all naturally, as if she'd been caring for his son for years. "You don't have to," he began. "I know," Agnes said, "but I want to—" Across the table, 2 young boys nudged each other and stared at Timothy. Their mother hissed something sharp, and they looked away, but Marcus had seen their faces. Not cruelty. Curiosity. The unfiltered interest of children encountering something new. Agnes caught their eyes and smiled. Not a warning look, not a protective glare. Just warmth, pure and simple. The boys blinked, confused by the lack of reproach. One of them, the blacksmith's son. Samuel offered a tentative smile in return. Timothy chose that moment to laugh. The sound burst out of him sudden and bright, startled loose by something only he understood. Heads turned. Forks paused. But Agnes laughed too, as if sharing the joke. And the moment passed. For the first time in 3 years, Marcus Callahan sat at a table with his neighbors. He didn't know whether to weep or run. He didn't either. He ate. The evening meal stretched on, course after course. And Marcus began to understand something about Agnes Whitmore. She was not performing kindness. She was living it. He watched her with Timothy really watched and saw no hesitation in her movements, no forced patience in her voice. When the boy flapped his hands with excitement over a particular taste, she flapped hers back, making it a game. When he hummed off key, She hummed along, finding harmony in his chaos. When food dribbled down his chin, she wiped it away without comment or fuss. "You're good with him," Marcus said during a quiet moment, while Timothy concentrated on separating his peas from his carrots. Agnes shrugged. "Children are children. They just need someone to see them clearly. Most folks don't see him at all. They see his condition. Then most folks are looking wrong." She said it simply, without judgment. And Marcus felt something shift in his chest. A loosening, maybe, or a cracking. The hall hummed with conversation around them. Someone had brought out a fiddle, and old tunes drifted through the warm air. Timothy's attention caught on the music, his head tilted, his body stilled. His whole being focused on the rise and fall of notes. "He likes that," Agnes observed. "He always has. Sarah used to sing to him." Marcus heard the catch in his own voice. When she was alive, Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I had a brother named Peter." Marcus looked at her. He was like Timothy, in some ways different. The doctor said he'd never walk, never talk, never amount to anything. Her eyes grew distant, focused on some memory Marcus couldn't see. They were wrong about the walking. He ran like the wind once he figured it out. But the talking, no. He never did find words. What happened to him? Fever. He was 8 years old. Agnes's hands stilled on the table. "It was quick. They said, a blessing. They said, I wanted to hit every person who called my brother's death a blessing." Her voice held old anger, old grief weathered but not vanished. Marcus recognized the texture of it. Loss didn't disappear. It just changed shape over time. "I'm sorry," he said. "It was 15 years ago." Agnes looked at Timothy, and her eyes softened. "But I still remember how he loved music. How he laughed at nothing anyone else could see. How he made me feel special just by reaching for my hand." Timothy, as if hearing her words, reached across the table and patted Agnes's arm. A random gesture. Perhaps, or perhaps not. The boy had his own wisdom, his own ways of knowing. Agnes covered his hand with hers. "I never got to take Peter anywhere," she said quietly. "Church socials, harvest dances, community suppers. Our parents were ashamed. They kept him hidden away, like something to apologize for." She met Marcus's eyes. "I won't let that happen to Timothy. Not while I have breath in my body." Marcus stared at her. This woman, this schoolteacher he'd barely known before tonight, carried grief that matched his own. She understood loss, understood differentness, understood the particular loneliness of loving someone the world refused to see. "Why didn't you say something before?" he asked. "In town. At the schoolhouse you could have spoken to me any time these past years." Agnes's smile turned rueful. "Would you have listened?" He wanted to say yes, but honesty won out. "Probably not. That's why I waited. For the right moment. For a time when you might be ready to hear it." Across the hall, the fiddle struck up a livelier tune. Timothy bounced slightly in his seat, his body responding to the rhythm in its own particular way. Their eyes met Marcus's and Agnes's across the boy's bent head. Something unspoken passed between them. For the first time since Sarah died, Marcus didn't feel entirely alone. The peace couldn't last. Marcus had known that from the moment they walked through the door. It began with whispers, small sounds, half heard, drifting from nearby tables like smoke from a dying fire. "Shouldn't be here. Disturbing decent folks. That boy isn't right in the head. Everyone knows it. Poor Sarah must be spinning in her grave." Marcus's shoulders tightened. He kept his eyes on his plate, his jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. Beside him, Timothy had stopped eating. The boy's sensitivity to mood, usually a vulnerability, had sharpened into wariness. He knew something was wrong. Old Mr. Hendricks made no effort to lower his voice. "Some folks don't know their place," he announced to his table mates. Man ought to keep his troubles at home instead of inflicting them on everyone else. Marcus's hands curled into fists beneath the table. 3 years of silence. 3 years of staying away, of protecting his son from exactly this. And still it wasn't enough. Mrs. Patterson leaned toward her husband, speaking in that carrying whisper designed to be overheard. I'm just saying, it's not fair to the children. They'll have nightmares. That poor creature. He's not a creature. Agnes's voice cut across the hall like a blade. Silence fell again. All eyes turned toward their table. Agnes had risen from her seat, spine straight as a rifle barrel, her eyes blazing with cold fire. His name is Timothy. He's a 12-year-old boy who happens to see the world differently than you do. That doesn't make him less human. It makes him more remarkable. Mrs. Patterson's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. Well, No, you never bothered to learn his name. You never tried to understand his condition. You never once asked how Marcus was doing, raising a child alone after his wife died. Timothy, overwhelmed by the tension, made a distressed sound. His hands fluttered. He knocked over his cup, sending cider spreading across the linen tablecloth in a dark stain. Someone at a far table giggled a child's cruel laugh. Quickly hushed. Marcus surged to his feet. Every instinct screamed at him to grab Timothy and run, to flee back to the safety of their cabin, to never again try to belong to a world that didn't want them. But Agnes was faster. She placed her hand on Timothy's shoulder, gentle and grounding, and began to speak in a low, calm voice words meant only for him. Sounds more than language. A soothing rhythm that cut through his panic. Gradually, Timothy's fluttering hands stilled. His breathing slowed. He looked up at Agnes with complete trust. Then she turned to face the room. Her gaze moved across the assembled townspeople, the whisperers and the silent ones, the accusers and the uncomfortable bystanders. When she spoke, her voice carried to every corner. This boy has more kindness in his little finger than some folks have in their whole hearts. He has never spoken a cruel word about anyone, not once in his whole life. Can every person in this room say the same? No one answered. Mrs. Patterson dropped her eyes to her plate. Mr. Hendricks suddenly found his cider fascinating. The giggling child was being hustled out by mortified parents. Agnes remained standing for a long moment. Then, slowly, she sat back down and smoothed the stained tablecloth as if nothing had happened. More turkey. Timothy, she asked brightly. The boy made a sound that might have been yes. Agnes served him another slice. Marcus sank into his chair, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had never, not once in his life, seen anyone fight for his son like that. He didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. But his hand found Agnes's beneath the table and squeezed. Once. Hard. She squeezed back. The silence after Agnes's stand stretched like taffy, thick and uncomfortable. Marcus waited for the inevitable, the request to leave, the hostile stares, the final rejection that would seal their isolation forever. Instead, something unexpected happened. Nothing. The hall gradually returned to its business. Forks scraped plates. Conversations resumed. Quieter now, but present. No one asked them to leave. No one approached with more cruel words. But no one approached with kind ones either. They existed in a bubble of uneasy tolerance, surrounded by people who had witnessed their presence defended and didn't quite know what to do with that. Information. Timothy had recovered from his earlier distress. He ate his second helping of turkey with careful concentration, occasionally glancing at Agnes as if to confirm she was still there. She always was. Marcus leaned close to her, speaking low. They'll never accept us. Not really. Why do you even try? Agnes considered the question while she cut a piece of pie. Do you know what my father used to say? Can't say I do. He said, some fences take longer to mend. Doesn't mean they can't be mended. She met his eyes. Giving up means they win. Marcus. And I don't let small people win. Easy to say. You're not the one who has to live here after tonight. Neither do you. Not the way you have been. Anyway, Agnes's expression softened. You've been surviving, not living. There's a difference. Before Marcus could answer, movement caught his attention. Young Samuel, the blacksmith's son, maybe 8 years old, was approaching their table. He walked hesitantly, glancing back at his parents as if seeking permission they hadn't given. In his hands he carried a small wooden horse, crudely carved but well-loved. Samuel stopped beside Timothy's chair. The two boys studied each other. Samuel curious, Timothy wary. "Want to play?" Samuel asked. The question hung in the air. Marcus held his breath. Timothy looked at the wooden horse. His hand reached out slowly, touched its mane, traced the curve of its neck. Then he took it from Samuel's grasp and began moving it across the table in a trotting motion, making soft sound effects. Samuel laughed. He likes it. The joy in his voice was genuine. The uncomplicated delight of a child who had found a playmate. He pulled up a chair and produced another horse from his pocket, joining Timothy's game with enthusiastic whinnies and galloping sounds. Marcus watched his son play with another child. The sight was so ordinary, so impossibly rare, that his vision blurred with unshed tears. Other children drifted closer, drawn by curiosity. A girl with red braids, a boy missing his front teeth. They watched Samuel and Timothy play, their faces open and interested. "Can I try?" the girl asked. Timothy looked up at her. For a long moment, he didn't respond. Then he picked up a napkin, folded it clumsily into something that might have been a saddle, and held it out to her. She took it with a smile. "Thanks." The children played together, their laughter rising above the murmur of adult conversation. Parents watched from nearby tables, some wary, some surprised, some wearing expressions that looked almost like shame. Agnes touched Marcus's arm. "See that?" she murmured. "That's belonging. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in moments like this." Marcus watched his son smile at a girl he'd just met. He watched Samuel show Timothy how to make his horse jump over a spoon. He watched childhood happen in the simplest, most precious way possible. For the first time in 3 years, hope didn't feel like a wound waiting to happen. The evening softened as it aged. More children gathered around Timothy's end of the table, drawn by the game that had grown to include a whole herd of imaginary horses, a river made of gravy boats, and a mountain constructed from bread rolls. Timothy presided over the chaos with quiet authority, his different way of seeing transforming simple objects into an entire world. Marcus noticed that parents had stopped watching with wariness. Some even smiled. Widow Pearson approached with a second slice of pumpkin pie, setting it before Timothy with ceremonial care. "Growing boy needs his pie," she said. Then she patted Marcus's shoulder, a brief touch, but waited with meaning. "Sarah would be proud of both of you." The word struck Marcus like a benediction. He couldn't speak, only nodded. The minister, Reverend Cole, a weathered man with gentle eyes, made his way to their table. He'd been Sarah's pastor, had spoken the words over her grave, had tried to visit afterward until Marcus stopped answering the door. "Mr. Callahan," he said, extending his hand, "it's good to see you. Truly good." Marcus shook the offered hand. "Reverend, we have services Sunday morning. I know it's been a while, but..." He glanced at Timothy, who was showing a little girl how to balance a bread roll on a spoon. "The door is always open, for everyone." Everyone. The word carried weight tonight. A spoon clinked against a glass, cutting through the hall's gentle noise. Mayor Thompson had risen from his seat at the head table, a stocky man with a gray beard and the kind of voice that carried without shouting. "Folks, if I might have your attention." Conversations faded. Faces turned toward the mayor. "It's Thanksgiving," Mayor Thompson said, "and we've got much to be thankful for. Good harvest. Mild weather. Community that pulls together when times get hard. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room until it landed on Marcus and Timothy. We've also got new friends at our table this year. Well, he smiled, a bit ruefully. Not new exactly. Just away too long. He raised his glass. To the Callahans. Welcome back. Welcome back. The room echoed not everyone. Not with full enthusiasm, but enough. Enough voices. Enough raised glasses. Enough acknowledgement that they belonged here. Had always belonged here. Had only been waiting for someone to say so. Timothy looked up from his game. Sensing the attention, his face showed confusion. Then something like delight. He raised his glass of cider, mimicking the adults around him, and made a happy sound. Laughter rippled through the hall. Warm laughter. Not cruel. Marcus felt something break open inside him. He had spent 3 years building walls, protecting his son from hurt, protecting himself from hope. But walls kept out more than pain. They kept out everything. Agnes was right. He had been surviving, not living. He watched her help Timothy with his coat as the evening wound down. They moved together naturally, she anticipating his needs. He responding to her presence with instinctive trust. 3 people who had been strangers that morning now looked almost like a family. Marcus stood, bones creaking, and offered Agnes his arm. Walk you home. She smiled that fierce, warm smile he was coming to know. I rather thought I'd walk you home. Make sure you get there safe. They stepped out into the cold night together, Timothy between them, each of his hands claimed by an adult. Stars blazed overhead, their breath clouded in the November air. Behind them, the community hall's light faded as they climbed the hill. Before them, the cabin waited dark, familiar, safe. But something had changed. Marcus felt it in his chest, in the way his heart beat, in the lightness of his step despite the cold. For the first time in years, he wasn't walking away from something. He was walking toward it. The path up the hill had never seemed so short. They walked in comfortable silence, the 3 of them, with only the crunch of frozen grass beneath their feet and Timothy's contented humming to break the stillness. The autumn moon hung full and golden overhead, casting long shadows across the frosted ground. Marcus kept stealing glances at Agnes. The moonlight caught her profile, illuminating the strength in her jaw, the softness around her eyes. She had fought for his son tonight. She had stood before an entire town and declared Timothy extraordinary. No one had ever done that. Not even him. Can I ask you something? Marcus said. Agnes looked at him. You can ask me anything. Why tonight? Why come up that hill after all this time? She was quiet for a moment, considering. Timothy had found a stick somewhere and was dragging it along the ground, making patterns in the frost that only he understood. I'd been watching you, Agnes finally said. Both of you. Whenever you came to town for supplies, I saw the way people looked at Timothy, the way they looked away, and I saw the way you squared your shoulders and pretended it didn't hurt. I wasn't pretending. Yes, you were. Her voice held no judgment. We all pretend, when the truth is too heavy to carry in public. But I kept thinking, what a waste. What a terrible waste of a beautiful boy and a good father, hidden away on that hill like something shameful. They reached the cabin. Its dark windows reflected the moonlight, and the cold chimney spoke of a fire gone to embers. Timothy tugged toward the door, but Agnes held his hand gently, keeping him there in the moonlight for just a moment longer. You asked me why, she said, turning to face Marcus fully. The true answer is simple. She reached up and touched Timothy's head, smoothing his wild hair with a tenderness that made Marcus's throat tighten. Because he's extraordinary. Agnes said, You both are. Marcus stared at her. This woman who had appeared on his doorstep like an answer to a prayer he'd stopped praying. She had seen what no one else bothered to see. She had fought when no one else would fight. She had brought him back to his community, his neighbors, his life. He cupped her face in his work-rough hands. Her skin was cold from the night air, but her eyes were warm. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "I don't want thanks." Agnes's voice was barely above a whisper. "I want you to stop hiding. I want you to let people in. I want Timothy to have the life he deserves." "And what about you? What do you want for yourself?" She smiled that fierce, tender smile. "I want to be there to see it. All of it." Marcus kissed her. It was soft at first, tentative, the kiss of a man who had forgotten how, who had closed that part of himself away with Sarah's death. But Agnes responded with warmth, with welcome, with the same stubborn courage she brought to everything. Between them, Timothy giggled. They broke apart, laughing, and looked down at the boy. He was grinning his rare grin, bouncing slightly on his heels, delighted by something he couldn't express but clearly understood. "I think he approves." Agnes said, "I think he's smarter than both of us." Timothy tugged at their hands, pulling them toward the cabin with impatient insistence. The cold was deepening, and even a boy who saw the world differently knew when it was time to go inside. They reached the door. Marcus paused with his hand on the latch. The cabin had been his fortress for 3 years, his protection, his prison. He had convinced himself that isolation was safety, that walls were kindness, that keeping Timothy hidden was somehow keeping him whole. He had been wrong. He pushed the door open. It swung wide, lamplight spilling out into the nightlight he must have left burning without realizing, a beacon on the hill for anyone climbing up. "Come in," he said to Agnes. "It's cold out here." She stepped across the threshold. Timothy followed, already heading for his favorite chair, already reaching for the carved wooden horse Samuel had pressed into his hands as they left a gift between. New friends. Marcus stood in the doorway for a moment longer, looking out at the night. Below, the community hall's lights had dimmed. Tomorrow, people would wake and return to their lives, some changed by tonight, some not. The world wouldn't transform overnight, but it didn't need to. It just needed a door left open, a hand extended, a voice willing to say, "You belong here." He stepped inside and closed the door, not against the world, but simply against the cold. Agnes was kneeling by the hearth, coaxing the embers back to life. Timothy had settled in his chair, the wooden horse clutched in his hands, humming softly to himself. The cabin no longer felt like a hiding place. It felt like a home. Marcus crossed to the window, the same window where he'd stood earlier that evening, watching the golden light below with an aching heart. Now he looked out and saw the autumn moon hanging huge and golden over Cedar Hollow. Agnes rose and came to stand beside him. He took her hand. "Thank you," he said, "for coming up that hill. Thank you for opening the door." Timothy's humming drifted through the cabin, a melody only he understood, but one that sounded. For the first time, like it belonged, Marcus pulled Agnes close and watched the moonlight spill across the valley below. Tomorrow would bring questions, challenges, more whispers and more courage required. But for this moment, this one perfect moment, there was only warmth and belonging, and the quiet miracle of acceptance. Finally.